I'm the pastor of a large church with locations in Carlisle and Dillsburg, Pennsylvania, and I noticed a pattern a few years ago. I would give a sermon on a Sunday morning, and there was a group of people who would come up to me and say, "That was so helpful. Thank you for making these connections. I think that I will probably remember that for weeks and months to come, and it'll really help me to apply these things to my life." And I had another group of people that was smaller but still significant that would say things like, "I don't really understand what it is you were trying to say this morning. I didn't make any of those connections, and I'm pretty sure I disagreed with most of the words that came out of your mouth." So I started to ask the question, how is it that a group of people can hear the same message in the same room and walk away from that experience with totally different ideas about what was trying to be communicated or how helpful it was? And maybe more importantly, how do you take this group of people who see the world very differently and help get them on the same page when it comes to mission and values? So we started looking into this, and we found a number of psychological and sociological models, and I want to talk to you about one this morning called spiral dynamics. We didn't invent this. Don Beck and Christopher Cowan, as well as Claire Graves, did a lot of work on this, and application was done by groups like the liturgists and people like Rob Bell. And so we started asking, how is it that we can understand our people better? And this system of spiral dynamics was helpful for us. Spiral dynamics postulates that about 98% of the population has about 6 different value systems. Value systems are just a set of corresponding beliefs and behaviors. And so what I want to do this morning is walk you through those 6 value systems, and then we're going to talk a little bit about Facebook, used cars, evolution, and a giant fish, and then I'll be done, okay? So the very first value system, these all correspond with a color. Some people like that, some people hate it. Probably depends on what your value system is. But the very first one we're going to think about is beige. Beige is the color of survival. Beige is trying to think about the next 24 hours. How do I get from today to tomorrow? Beige is the color then of homelessness. Oftentimes, if you talk to someone about the homeless population, you might hear them say things like, well, you know what? They just need to go get a job. They may not be the absolute sharpest tool in the shed, but they could flip burgers or McDonald's or probably be CEO of Wells Fargo. There's something that they could do, right? And what they don't understand is that to get a job actually takes a lot of preparation. You have to have a phone number that someone can reach you at. You usually have to find a computer in order to fill out an online application. Typically, you have to have a mailing address. You have to have clothes where you can go and do a job interview, transportation to get to and from work. There's a lot of planning that's involved in getting a job. And what spiral dynamics essentially says is that if your framework for seeing the world, if that's how you're processing information in your mind, it's very difficult to think past the next 24 to 48 hours if you're in beige. And so getting a job isn't on your radar because you're not really even capable of doing that. Beige tends to be the color then of addiction, people who struggle with alcohol, people who struggle with drugs. And it tends to be the color as well of material, and not materialism. When I say material, I mean the things that you need to survive, things like bread and shelter and clothing. But there's always the chance that someone at beige will actually move a click up the spiral, and that would be to purple. Purple is what happens when the caveman actually exits his cave and starts to figure out there are some things in this world that are beyond my control. So there's this ball of fire in the sky, and there's water that falls from the sky, and I don't have any control over that stuff, but what I do notice is that depending on how those things play out, my crops are better or worse. It's what happens when they say, you know, we go after animals sometimes and we try to hunt them down, and sometimes after just an hour we're able to come back to the rest of the tribe and we're able to feed them, and it's exciting. And then sometimes we're gone for days and we're chasing animals and we don't get anything. We come back and it's almost like the spirit of the hunt is not with us. Purple starts to believe that I don't have control. There are things happening outside of my control, factors, but maybe there are these spirits or these gods that are in control. And if I could just get the gods on my side, then we'd be able to have better fortune in life. So this tends to be highly tribalistic. Purple is deals a lot with tribalism. It tends to be really mystic. It also tends to be very, very superstitious. And purple tends to be disempowered. We don't have the power to do this, but if we can get the gods on our side, perhaps it will work out. Now you may think in the 21st century in the United States, we probably don't have a lot of purple in our society, but that just means you've never been to a football game on a Sunday afternoon. There's no way to cheer for the Cleveland Browns year after year unless you are holding out hope that the gods will intervene at some point and give us a quarterback who can throw the friggin' ball, right? And so we actually have quite a bit of superstition in the United States, and there are quite a few people who would fall into this category, or at least would have a lot of this inside of them. If you've ever heard anybody say to you, everything happens for a reason, that's a very purple belief. But it's always possible that you'll decide, I'm tired of waiting around for some forces to get active and to make my life better. I'm going to grab the bull by the horns. I'm going to do it myself. And so there's always the chance that you'll go from purple to red. If purple is disempowerment, red is power. Red is dominance. Red is the ego or the will. Red is rebellion. Red is essentially Saddam Hussein standing over the village with an AK-47. It's Vladimir Putin deciding unilaterally to go into Crimea. Red is the color of rap music. It says, I started off in this neighborhood and things weren't going well and most of my friends are still stuck there or they got killed, but I was able to grab the bull by the horns and take it and get things done. And so red ends up being the color of the mafia, and red, importantly, is the color of 2-year-olds everywhere. There's always the chance that you'll figure out, if we all stick with red, we're going to kill each other. And so there's always the chance that someone moves from red to blue. Blue is the color of tradition. Blue is the color of order. It's the color of dualistic thinking. It's typically very black and white in the way that it sees the world. Things are a certain way, and it's very obvious to people who are in blue. In blue, you still have some of the narcissism that came from red. But in blue, instead of the narcissism being toward the individual, I'm the greatest, I'm the best, in blue, the narcissism is for the group. My group is the greatest. My group, the people who agree with me are the best. And if anyone disagrees with us, blue gets very defensive very quickly because they know that they are the best. Blue also tends to be the color that says the book or the code or the law is absolutely the highest value and the highest thing. If you've ever heard someone talk about the United States Constitution as if it were a divine book handed down from on high by God himself, that's a very blue way of thinking about a document. If you've ever heard someone in religious circles talk about the Bible or the scriptures in a way that says, the Bible says it, that settles it, as if there's no room for interpretation or historical criticism, then that's a very blue statement. But there's always a chance that that person in that religious circle will go to college and they'll start to learn that, sometimes our religious book it disagrees with itself. 1 Samuel says that David killed Goliath and 2 Samuel says someone else killed him. There's always the chance that that highly patriotic person will go to college and start to learn, the founding of our country isn't as black and white as you think. There's a lot of ugliness in this picture. And so there's always the chance that someone gets their worldview disrupted and they move to orange. Orange is the color of modernity. Orange is the color of achievement. Orange is the color of enlightenment. Orange is the color of individualism. Orange is what happens when we actually are able to take the world apart, we feel like, and figure it out a little bit. What is it that's going on? How can we take the world apart and have this be helpful to us? Orange is the color of science, and it's the color of Wall Street. Because it's high achievement, though, and because it tends to be pretty individualistic, there are lots of people who don't particularly love orange. In fact, sometimes you hang out on orange for a while and you decide to shift a little bit. You start to figure out that, orange can't really tell me everything there is that I want to know about the world. And so sometimes people figure out, orange can tell me why I don't have a tail as a human being, but orange can't tell me why I find that so interesting. And so you move from orange to green. Green is the color of postmodernism. Green is egalitarian. It's relativistic. So it says that we should all be treated equally. We should take away some hierarchy. We should all live on a flat plane. Green ends up being the color of movements like Occupy Wall Street. Green says, my tribe has a story, but my tribe's story hasn't always been the best for other tribes out there. At Green, you start to realize how some of your own shortcomings and the shortcomings of your group have had a negative impact on other people and other groups. You tend to think a lot more about how the planet, and you start to be a lot more mindful of the environment at Green. At Green, you tend to be a lot more sensitive to other people's stories. Now, there are good and bad all along this spiral. So blue, for instance, gets a lot of flack for it being too traditional. and having too much order, but we all want to be able to pull on some blue values for our lives. You need to be able to tell your 13-year-old, hey, in this household, we shower, right? This is important. Green tends to be thought of as like, almost solely in good terms, and yet green has a very hard time actually organizing anything because they tend to be so egalitarian in the way that they approach it. So we all tend to need each other. Now, as you move through the spiral, you tend to transcend and include the stages before you. So it's not that you get to blue and you totally do away with red and purple. It's that you've actually transcended red and purple at that point, and they still are a part of who you are. As you move through this, then, you actually look forward with great fear, and you look back with great disdain. So blue people tend to think that orange people are heretics, or they're all just about the stats and they don't care about people. Orange people tend to think that blue people don't care enough about what is actually real and relevant and measurable. Green people think that everyone should stop arguing so much because we should just all love each other. And if you understand that dynamic, you understand Facebook. Think about the last time that you saw someone win a Facebook argument. Spoiler alert, that's never happened. So why is that though? Someone jumps on and they say, I'm supporting this political candidate, or I'm supporting that political candidate, and someone else just has to get their 2 cents in as to why that's a terrible decision, right? So you have a blue person who, and blue tends to, not everyone, but blue tends to go more Republican. So you have a blue person and they say, I'm supporting this person and here's why. And then someone who's in an orange category jumps on and is like, well, you shouldn't do that because you need to look at this chart from Vox.com, and Ezra Klein says this, and here's what Paul Krugman says. You need to watch this video clip from Rachel Maddow and Stephen Colbert. And here's the important thing to note. What orange finds convincing, blue does not find convincing. And so orange can give them all the stats, all the data, all the websites, all the videos, but here's the thing. Blue knows that these people and these websites are not in blue's tribe. And so blue has already determined these are not trustworthy people, statistics, or websites to follow. I don't care what they say. You also talk to people differently then depending on where they are. You sell things differently. You persuade people differently depending on where they are in this model of spiral dynamics. So how do you sell someone a car who's red and has power and dominance as some of the key things that they're looking for? If you've ever seen a hot rod magazine, what you almost always see on the front of those is a nice car with a woman in a bikini on it, because that sells something of power and dominance. So if you're at a used car lot and you're trying to sell to people who have a value system of red, you put the woman on the bikini in front of it. If you have a used car lot and you're trying to sell to someone who is blue, you crank up the Toby Keith and you raise the American flag as high as possible. You tell them, I'm in your tribe, we get one another. If you're trying to sell to people who are orange, you tell them, you know what, this is the most logical decision you could make. It won the J.D. Powers and Associates Award 5 years in a row. You should definitely go with this car. And if you're trying to sell a used car to someone who's green, it's a hybrid, right? So there's ways to talk to people who are all along this scale. Here's what we've tried to do as a church then. We recognize that our congregation is very diverse and very different. And so we've tried to ask the question every time we communicate, whether it's a sermon on a Sunday morning or communication throughout the week, who is in the room with us? And here's what we know. We have large swaths of blue and green and orange in the room with us. And so that means when we're trying to talk about a particular topic, the way that we approach that topic, we're trying to consider who's in the room, and we try to tailor it so that every person has something that they can get out of it. So a few years ago, I started talking to our group about the fact that faith and science don't have to be at odds with one another. I started talking to them about the fact that you can be a Christian, consider yourself a follower of Jesus, and still believe in evolution. So where do I pull quotes to teach this kind of thing? Do I talk to them about Neil deGrasse Tyson and Richard Dawkins? Well, my oranges don't care because they're reading that stuff anyway. They're very into science, and as long as I let them believe what they believe, they're totally fine with that. Green doesn't care because green just loves everybody and hopes that we all get along. So if we talk about how we can be more inclusive, that's a win for green. But my blue people, they know that Neil deGrasse Tyson and Richard Dawkins aren't in the tribe that they consider their tribe. So I read them this quote, and this quote says that, God created, and we can debate the different understanding of how specifically that happened, but that perhaps it was from evolution. And the person who said that quote, Billy Graham. Well, Billy Graham and I don't share the same value system, but we share some of the same religious beliefs. And I've got a whole group of people in my congregation who do share the value system of Billy Graham. He's one of us. He's in our tribe. And so I'm just asking who's in the room, how do we talk about this? It even goes to preaching when I'm talking about something like a story out of the Old Testament. There's a story that you're probably familiar with. It's the story of Jonah. Jonah was this person who was asked by God to go and speak to his greatest enemies about God's love, but he doesn't want to do that because they're his greatest enemies. He doesn't like these people. So he flees in the other direction, and this fish comes and swallows him, and Jonah's in the fish's belly for 3 days until he gets spit out of the fish, and then he decides maybe it wouldn't be such a bad idea to go. That's the story. But anytime that story is talked about, we always get hung up on the stupid fish, right? Do we really have to believe all that? My oranges, they don't want to believe all that. But my blues, who are very traditionalist, if I tell them that maybe this fish was a concoction of some scholars back in that day in order to create a parable, a story, I might as well tell them, hey, that Jesus guy? Yeah, we're not going to talk about him anymore. That's not going to feel good. My oranges are going to say, if you insist that I believe in this stupid fish, then I am totally checked out. There's no way I can believe this is an actual story. And my greens don't care because they just love a good story. So what do we do here? I want to challenge everybody wherever they are because I believe that they can live more fully into who they were created to be. So for my blues in the room, I'm going to tell this story. And I'm going to say, hey, there are some people who don't believe that this story was literal. There's some people who believe it was a parable. And if that doesn't hit you the right way, I would just ask you to ponder on the question, is the truth of a story solely dependent on its historicity? Hey, and there are some of you here today who are trying to say, if this was a literal fish, like I'm checked out, I'm out of here. And I would just ask you to think about the question, is it possible that there are things that happen in this world and in this life that can't be fully measured and fully explained by science? Is that possible? Do I believe that's a possibility? These are the kinds of questions we want to ask to give people the space to think about the story. Because the story is about Jonah being asked to go to Nineveh, the capital city of his greatest enemy, the Assyrians. And this question that hangs over the whole story is, do you love even your enemies enough to share with them the grace and kindness of God? But see, that's the story for us. It's the question for us as well. Do we love even our enemies enough to share with them the kindness and the grace of God? We are so quick today to write people off because they don't see the world the same way that we do. We're so quick today to be fearful of others who have different perspectives. What Spiral Dynamics has taught our church, and what I hope it will teach other organizations and institutions, is that every person is valuable, and we are only made stronger by the participation of those who see things a little differently. My hope for you is that you will be able to tailor your communication, the way that you run your companies, your organizations, the way you get along with your coworkers, so that every one of them feels highly valued, and so that every one of them can contribute to the cause. Thank you.